All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's good to have you join us this evening. We're excited to have Mark Milke with us tonight. I would like to open with a few encouragements for you in promotion of Freedom Defense Canada. I would like to encourage you to continue to engage with our speaker series fundraiser as we continue to raise funds on an ongoing basis for the speakers that we continue to bring in for you. I'd also like to encourage those of you who are not members of Freedom Defense Canada to join us. You can do that on our website. And joining us also helps to support us. We can't do what we're doing without your financial support. So we appreciate you for taking that into consideration. We also ask you to support us on our various social media platforms. We have a number of platforms that we're on. We are on Facebook, where you can read the posts and you can like, comment, and share those. And also we are on YouTube and Rumble. You can check us out there, hit the subscribe button there so we know that you're checking us out over there. Also, take a listen to FDC's podcast on Substack and Spotify, sorry. And finally, I want to just bring up a few things in regards to Zoom etiquette and the question and answer period that will follow this. So in order to create an atmosphere of respect for our speaker and for each other, we ask that you will mute your mic during the presentation. Just keep your mics muted. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session, which will be in two parts. There'll be the first part where you can submit your questions to the chat box, and then we'll have an open mic session after that. And Perry will give us some more details about the Q&A afterwards. So with that being said, I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight. There he is, Mark Milke. Mark has his PhD in international relations and political philosophy. He is the founder and president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. Mark is a public policy analyst and author. His policy work has been published by numerous think tanks in Canada and also internationally. He is the editor of the Aristotle Foundation's first book, which was the 1867 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished, Not Cancelled. I'm sure a number of you have read it or at least seen it. His newest book is entitled The Victim Cult, How the Grievance Culture Wrecks Civilization. Most recently, you may have seen Mark interviewed on the National Post by John Ivison in regards to the Aristotle Foundation's report on DEI in university admissions, which of course is a rather hot topic in the academic world these days. So Mark, welcome. Thank you for being with us this evening. We look forward to hearing what you have to share with us. So thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you everyone for attending and for the invitation from the board. So I guess I'll just start with maybe why the Aristotle Foundation. I've been thinking about some of these issues for a very long time. I remember reading a book in 1987 by Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind. And I hadn't gone to university yet. I was taking some time after high school trying to find myself, working at a grocery store in Kelowna, Overweighty. You may remember that chain. It's been since folded into Save On Foods. But that was my job for 2.5 years after high school, having graduated in Kelowna in 1985. But I remember reading Closing of the American Mind, and Bloom, of course, is, kind of a gay philosophy professor from the University of Chicago. So, didn't fit maybe boxes of, people you might think are concerned about, traditional whatever, at least according to the stereotypes. Nonetheless, Bloom did a very good job of pointing out what the problem was in the universities in the 1980s already. And I think some of the problems have metastasized since then. So if I was looking back on it to point to a date where I sort of had concerns about some of the things that were happening around us, it might have even been back then. And since then, I went to university a couple of times, probably spent far too much time in the university. But as it was just noted, got my PhD ending in 2008, actually, at the University of Calgary. I took my time to go through my degrees. But the Aristotle Foundation, why that? Well, if you think about the age we live in, I would describe it perhaps this way: anti-reality, anti-responsibility, and anti-reason. Anti-reality. I think there's a plethora of boxes that can be checked when you use that term. The notion that Canada is a systemically racist country or genocidal even, I would argue that's anti-reality. That's not quite accurate in terms of Canadian history. It's a stretch, to put it mildly. Um, or what else can we say is anti-reality these days? I'm in Calgary right now. It's minus 27. The notion that you can do without oil and gas, even though we don't do energy at the Aristotle Foundation, many think tanks cover that. That's a good modern day example. If you think you can do without oil and gas, or by 2025, I would point you to the work of a Winnipeg professor, the university professor Václav Smil, who's written a lot of energy transition, energy transitions, and argues you can't simply flip a switch and of course transition to some new form of energy, or think solar, for example, will take you where you want to go in a hurry. So that's anti-reality. Anti-reason, well, there's a plethora of that these days. How about anti-responsibility? Um, the American economist Thomas Sowell said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing from memory, but it's in, I think, The Victim Cult or the 1867 Project, or both. We live in an age where it's popular to blame everyone in history for how we are today, but no one today takes responsibility. And I think that's a good indictment of our age as well. Unfortunately, you have a lot of people that run around being victims, and sometimes there are real victims, and I wouldn't downplay that. But you do have a good chunk of people increasingly in I would say the Anglosphere that play the victim card. President of the United States comes to mind once in a while. And it's not exactly true in some cases, or even when it is true, it's dangerous actually to play that for too long, because you just don't know what you'll end up with. And, we can talk about the book, The Victim Cult, a little bit if you want. And what I found there was it was a 7-year effort, not full time, but 7 years worth of research and writing, and then probably 6 months full time. And I finally finished it off. But the Aristotle Foundation. So this concern about living in an anti-reality, anti-responsibility, anti-reason age. There's other ways to describe the age we live in, but our goal anyway. So about 10 years ago, I began to think, listen, some of the existing think tanks, which do great work on a number of issues, whether it's taxes, the energy, the environment, as I mentioned, others, I began to think there was something missing. And maybe it's my political science background. I'm not an economist. I have a healthy appreciation for data, for empiricism. We use data and statistics to the Aristotle Foundation to ground ourselves. Got a senior economist who does exactly that. But I also thought there was something else missing, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And maybe it's when also I saw the rise of Jordan Peterson pushing back the University of Toronto when they said, you have to say X. Or whatever they wanted him to say. To me, forced speech is the antithesis of a free society, right? And it's just hypocritical. It's asking you to deny you may be wrong about something, but asking you to call someone, some name that you don't necessarily think is accurate, in this case, their gender. It's a denial of empiricism. It's a denial of your own eyes. And maybe you're mistaken, but nonetheless, you have to call it as you see it if you want to be honest and not go insane. So I thought it was more than interesting that Peterson had to push back against the university to say, I'm not going to be told what to do and what to say. And I did, I agree with Peterson on some things, disagree on others. That's the nature of the world. But certainly when he started, I thought, like, for example, I think his views on Ukraine today, at least the ones I heard some time ago, I wouldn't agree with. Nonetheless, I think in the main, he represented what I thought was a positive development, which is that there needed to be some pushback and some thinking about what was happening in universities in particular. And then you may remember a famous debate that he had on UK television. It was Channel 3 or something, where the host kept trying to, change his words for him or interpret his words to be exactly what they weren't. And it was disingenuous. And he just calmly pushed back again and again. So I thought, and that made him go viral around the world. So again, I mostly think Peterson has been right on a lot of stuff, and certainly right to push back on the nonsense that's been out there. So that was another indication to me that I thought we needed a think tank to work on what I'd call civilizational issues, and Western civilizational issues, or more even narrowly at the Anglosphere, right? And not take it for granted. I think it's tragic when people take their families for granted, take for granted maybe they had a peaceful environment growing up, and they throw it away, in some crazy fit of something. But it's the same with civilizations. Civilizations, as I like to explain to people, at least good ones, and the Western civilization is not the only one in history that you might want to, draw something from or inspiration from. Nonetheless, it's the one that I think has given the most people, most of the time, freedom and flourishing. If you understand what's developed since the Magna Carta, since 1688, and the English Revolution, or the argument that Americans would have that they were trying to make sure they, had their rights back from the English, trying to take them from them in 1776, and so on and so forth. But if you understand the development of especially the Anglosphere, and how we got to a place where women got the vote in Canada, and was it 1918 and or close thereof, and so on and so forth, and why the British Empire fought to abolish slavery. If you understand the progress that's been made, the kind of progress we like to think is progress in the last 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, then you have to have, I think, some respect for the civilization that brought it to the fore and made these things issues, and why, and understand that. And so I began to think that there was a lack of appreciation for that. And that, someone like Peterson, for example, who I just mentioned, is akin to a fighter pilot. He's great in the air war. But a think tank is what can do this stuff on the ground, day in and day out, to look at some policies, recommend changes, look at the idea culture. And in essence, that's what think tanks, at least good ones, and hopefully if they're based in reality, do, which is to understand what's wrong with a policy, diagnose it correctly, if they're involved in policy, and we do some of that, but the same with ideas. Look at an idea, have some framework for analyzing it, and tell you, hopefully if they're honest and do their work well, why that idea is correct, excellent, or harmful and bad. And so at the Aristotle Foundation, our motto, our mission is to champion reason, democracy, and civilization, so all can live in a free and flourishing Canada. And I really mean that. And as I mentioned, reason, I mentioned examples of reason earlier. Democracy, how do you improve democracy in Canada? I think, for example, majority governments, they've been referred to as four-year dictatorships. That's not always far off. I think they can be improved with better recall and referendum laws. Precisely so Canadians, like the Swiss and some American states, you could kind of push back and forth between politicians and citizens, and it'd be useful for both to kind of dialogue through referendums and even recall if necessary about how to fix things. And so I think Canadians need a slightly modified version of our democracy. And then civilization, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's a lot there. You could refer to civilizations in history that you might admire, or bits of them. You could refer to the Western civilization writ large, the Anglosphere more narrowly. But are there things in civilization you wish to preserve? And I think in many cases you would say yes, and you want to build upon the successes of the past. That's another part of our kind of goal here at the Aristotle Foundation, not dismiss the wrongs of the past, but build on the successes of the past. And the reason for that is civilizations are like an oak tree. I live in Calgary, as I mentioned. So some of you may know. Anybody want to guess? Let's do a quick Q&A here. What happens in Calgary in the summertime around 3 or 4 in the afternoon? Any guesses? And someone will have to, if you see comments, I don't see the comments side yet, so someone will have to put up their hand or guess. What happens around 3 or 4 in the afternoon? Almost like clockwork every day in the summertime in Calgary, if you're unlucky. Hail, right? You get these storms that come in from the Rocky Mountains, combination of the Rocky Mountain cool air plus the hot air, and it piles on your car. And I've been hit 3 times by hail, so I just don't go out between 2 and 5 if I can avoid it. Well, an oak tree, and I often think, look, if I had an oak tree, I don't know if we even have them in Alberta, we may, but if there was an oak tree that I could park under in the middle of a hailstorm, it might mostly protect the car and me. And that's kind of like a civilization, right? Civilization takes a long time to build, just like an oak tree takes a long time to grow. But if you have a decent civilization worth preserving, I'm not talking Mao's China, I'm not talking the Soviet Union or Lenin and Stalin or at all. But if you have a civilization that's been built up over time, like that in the Anglosphere, whether it's Canada, the United States, the UK, the French, give them some credit, or other civilizations, right? I mean, I hope China reforms. It's got some deep roots in world history, obviously. I just hope it reforms to be a little more friendly to individuals, and markets and the rest of it. But if you have a civilization worth preserving, then what do when you see a flaw? You don't, as some people today in Canada do, see a flaw or see an historical flaw and say, oh, that's a diseased limb. Let's take down the entire tree. Why would you do that? What you do is you lop off the limb, you prune it. That's what you do with trees, right? You make them healthier by getting the diseased limb off, and then hopefully your tree survives that cut, and it usually does, and it grows, it continues to grow and shelter people. And that's like an oak tree. And an oak tree, like a civilization and vice versa. I mean, an oak tree needs nourishment, which is kind of like ideas or water in the civilization, hopefully the right ones. You need some resistance, right? Trees grow, or they root themselves better through some wind, some resistance, because it makes the roots go deeper, tests the roots. Same with an oak tree, same with civilization. You don't cut your roots off because it's your roots that anchor you as a tree and as a civilization. Again, it doesn't mean everything is perfect in the development of the tree or a civilization, but I would argue, by and large, to get where we got to by the 1960s, 1970s, where it was no longer okay to discriminate, against anyone based on skin color. Still maybe iffy in terms of the treatment of women in some cases, but nonetheless, in law anyway, if not always in individual attitudes or practice, I think the Anglosphere, and I don't know much about, again, some of the other countries, the non-English countries, but in the Anglosphere anyway, whether you're talking about the United States or Canada, New Zealand, the UK, so on and so forth, we got to a point where I think it was pretty common agreement by the time I was born, that you wanted individuals to be treated equally. It doesn't mean everybody was going to turn out the same way, because we're all very different flavors and talents and aptitudes. But the idea was an individual in law and policy should be treated as equal without exception. You don't get to be treated worse or better because of your skin color. That was a good ideal to subscribe to and to quasi-arrive at. The Martin Luther King vision, even though Martin Luther King had some exceptions to that, right, including affirmative action, which we can get into. But nonetheless, that was a great place to arrive at. Now I think we've kind of, we've retreated from that for a whole bunch of justifications I read about in The Victim Cult, and to a lesser degree that some of us wrote about in the 1867 Project. It's one of the reasons at Aristotle we've done DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, not because there's anything necessarily wrong with any one of those terms, but it depends on how they're interpreted and implemented. And would argue mostly in a negative way, right? Basically, obviously discriminating against people based on their unchangeable characteristics, which again is what I thought we were getting away from. And I understand all the reasons why today in universities and elsewhere, some people really like DEI and they think it's the greatest thing since peanut butter on bread. But it's not, because again, it's anti-individual, it's illiberal, it's anti-merit. And it attempts to make up for the past in a way that I don't think you can realistically do. And creates new injustices with new people. So Pierre Trudeau, who was wrong about most things, but not this, wrong about the economy, wrong about foreign affairs, Pierre Trudeau said something to the effect of, we're not here to apologize for past generations. It is our duty to be just in our time. And I think that's exactly right. You can only make up for the past if it's really recently. If I step on, Mike's foot and injure it and he sues me or whatever, I have to pay him money to go to the doctor, assuming doctors billed, which they don't, but you get my point. If I did something to Mike and he suffered an injury, it'd be more than fair ball for him to sue me or, request some compensation. But the further you go back in history, the less strong that link becomes. So if it's after World War II, we absolutely owed Japanese Canadians restitution for the property that was stolen from them by governments, for the time they spent in internment camps, even though there's no really way to compensate monetarily for that loss of time. But we were right to, and arguably in the 1950s, and there was some compensation in the 1980s as well, it wasn't what it should have been. So there are times in history where a government should compensate, you should compensate. This is part of the law. But when people try and drag that out over centuries and pretend that your ancestors beat up my ancestors, mine are German, maybe yours are Scottish and English, and they fought, should the Scots, compensate the English and vice versa for beating each other up 3 centuries ago? I would submit to you, no. Anyway, all of these issues, are part and parcel of why we started the Aristotle Foundation, to think through, should we compensate people in the modern age? And if so, for what and when? That's a big debate in the United States over slavery. In Canada, how do we make sure Indigenous people, First Nations, people have a great place to live, have opportunity. Well, there's some different opinions on that. I have mine. I think they're based in reality and some analysis, but nonetheless, there's some good arguments or some debate on that. Other modern day problems. Should 13-year-old girls really be leading policy on gender? I'm not so sure. I'm really not sure that 13-year-old girls, we should believe them when they say they want to be the opposite sex, because with respect, when you're 13, or 15 or 17, you think you know everything and you don't. We all thought we did at that age. So I'm just not sure that it's a good idea to give hormone blocking drugs to 13-year-old girls. So we published a study on that last year, actually, which went viral. And Elon Musk actually retweeted one of our graphics from the study. It was seen by over 30 million people. It was a study that compared Canada, the United States to Europe and the UK on gender transition practices for teenagers. And we deliberately chose that comparison because if you find that Sweden's a little more cautious on gender transition for teenagers than Canada is, you might want to scratch your head and go, do the Swedes know something, or just a little more cautious than we are, and why? So anyway, we've done a number of these issues since we got founded. What bad English that is. Since we were founded, the organization itself basically started with my idea about 4 years ago. I was working somewhere else, and I got a board together, and we started meetings literally this month, February, 4 years ago. Got a nonprofit number pretty quickly, got a charitable number in 2023, and then launched, even though we'd done some public stuff before that, in June 2023 with the 1867 Project, which is a compilation book by myself and others on Canadian history, basically saying, as the subtitle puts it, why Canada should be cherished, not canceled. So we've had decent success since then, publishing, growing the organization. We are a charity. I'll just say it now while I think of it. If you want to support us, we'd be happy to have you do that. You can get a charitable receipt. We also give some free books out when you do that. We've also got the old red ensign as a way to remember Canadian history. We'll send you that if you want instead of a book. Anyway, there's ways for you to support us if you'd like, including inviting me to more talks. But trying to think how I can wrap that, because I have gone on for about 20 minutes, which is what I promised I'd do, and then I'll open it up for Q&A. Let me think about what I'm most proud of. I think I'm most proud of, if I was asked that question, the fact that we've been able to impact public debate in Canada so quickly, and that we've given Canadians a voice in some issues where just a couple of years ago you would be shouted down when you shouldn't be. These are important issues to debate. Should you discriminate against other human beings? And if so, on what basis? I mean, there are times where you want to, maybe, but I think they're rare examples. You want to discriminate in favor of someone who is a handicapped situation and give them a hand up. You want to discriminate, if I can put it that way, in favor of the elderly because they're elderly, so you want to do favors for people based on things that will really help them in their specific situation, but you don't want to discriminate in any broad sense against people for unchangeable characteristics, which have nothing to do with the matter at hand. So we need to think through these things, I guess, is what I'm saying. And I think the Aristotle Foundation now has been part of the reason these issues are starting to be discussed more. And this past week was a good example of that. We spent a year and a half putting together what we call the University Discrimination Index. We thought we'd get it out a lot sooner. It was released last week or 2 weeks ago, covered last week in the National Post and some other newspapers. My column was in the National Post today explaining it in more detail. And I'd like to think we've had some decent impact already. And we'd like to do some really novel issues in the future. Let me give one example, and then I'll show you some pictures of the books that we've published and then open it up for Q&A. But when I was with another smaller think tank, the Frontier Center out of Winnipeg back in 2010, I was asked by a donor if I'd like to do something on immigration, helping immigrant families in Canada. And I saw a column in the National Post by Aruna Pap, who originally had come from India, was a social worker in Toronto, but had encountered some awful stuff in her social work, the abuse of women in some of the communities that she was tasked to help. So, and there was something called honor killings that was occurring now and then right around that time. So I tasked Aruna with a study to write on honor killings and try and get to the bottom of why and if anything could be done policy-wise. I mean, it was already against the law, as you can imagine, to murder your spouse or daughter or what have you, or sister, but nonetheless to investigate that. So I commissioned this to Aruna, and she wrote this study, and it went viral when it was released, to use a modern term. This was in 2010. There was a lot of attention paid to it. Aruna said I changed her life. I'm like, no, Aruna, you did that. You wrote the study. But she was invited to speak. Rana Ambrose, the Minister for the Status of Women, picked it up. And it brought a lot of attention to an issue. And you think about it, you're an immigrant woman. You don't necessarily know your rights. You don't necessarily know how you can escape a bad situation if you're abused. This blew people's minds because supposedly I'm a conservative. I don't know what that means. I mean, I do, but I don't like to use labels that often because I don't think they're helpful that much, especially these days. But even then, but I had a call from the Toronto Star and a columnist named Carol Gore, and she said, "Why would a conservative think tank do an issue like this?" I'm like, "Because it's a modern issue of freedom. These women may not have many resources or know where to go or what to do, and somebody should shine a light on this, right?" So we don't have slavery. I mean, there is human trafficking these days, but in the classical sense of people showing up in chains at ports, we don't have that. But we do have people that may be trapped in a situation because of their family, because of certain cultural expectations. And that needed to be analyzed and talked about openly. Because I think the truth, kind of like sunshine for an oak tree, if you want to find out where the flaws are and correct the flaws or cut off the bad limb, you need sunshine. It's a disinfectant. You don't really want to cut stuff in the dark or work in the dark, at least, with a chainsaw in your hand. So it's the same with issues out there. You want to expose them to sunlight and try and figure out what's happening. It doesn't mean government always has to do something, but even societally, culturally, you want to discuss these ideas and think about them out loud. Because maybe you can change some ideas that are wrong-headed or harmful. So anyway, I'll end with that, where that's an example of, we haven't done something I think that sort of dramatic or that maybe unpredictable for a think tank at Aristotle quite yet, although we've done some interesting stuff on conspiracy theories and again DEI and on gender transition. So I think some pretty groundbreaking work. But to me, that actually study is maybe the thing I'm most proud of that I commissioned many years ago, because to me, it was the right combination of vulnerable people who don't have a voice. We could do some work on it and do some good on exposing the problem. And, we'd like to do all sorts of interesting, novel, helpful work at the Aristotle Foundation in the years ahead, and we're just getting started. So why don't I stop there? That turned out to be longer than I planned. And I'll show you pictures. Why don't I just bring up the screen here for a moment and show you the books. So this is The Victim Cult. Oh, share, there we go. This is what, the first edition of this actually came out in 2019. But this is the new version, which has been updated. Ellis Ross, who some of you know, former MLA there, wrote the foreword. Bit of a story there, but I met Ellis and we got talking, and he, told him about the book somehow, and he says, "That's great." And then I thought, I need someone to write the foreword. Ellis, why don't you write it? What else can I show you here? This is the 1867 project. Some of you have released, like I said, in June 2023, became a bestseller right away. Went to #1 actually within a couple of weeks, which is we're quite proud of. We've sold probably 11 or 12,000 copies so far, in addition to giving some away, which for a Canadian book on history is huge. But it showed there was an appetite. And then lastly, here's the website, aristotlefoundation.org. So we can get the homepage here. So you'll find all sorts of things here. Our columns, some of our videos. This is one I recorded, a video we produced back in the fall on Israel and why Canadians should support it. The video on gender transition. You'll see our columns and what's new down under there. So that's a bit about us. So why don't I stop talking and now you can ask questions.
Okay, great. So just to remind people of how we do this, and we've done it in previous events and we'll be doing it for this one. The first half will be people submitting questions to the chat box, and then I'll communicate them to Mark and he can respond. And then after that, we'll do an open mic kind of thing. So I've opened up the chat box now, at least I think I have. Clicked it on host and co-host. So you should be able to put your questions in under, and they'll appear to me. And then of course I'll convey them to Mark. Depending on the number of questions I get, I will sometimes combine them so that people get the most exposure. And this, if they're the same topic, then we have one question of it. So we have one already, and then I'll have a few questions for you later, Mark. Mark, I'm a bit surprised that the foundation was not certain about the issue of gender transition. This is Rick Higgins. Is it not a fact that gender dysphoria during adolescence is the root of gender confusion? Why would we ever consider this as an issue that may benefit from the opinion of 13-year-old girls or 20-year-old women for that matter?
Well, I mean, so what we don't do at the Aristotle Foundation is take positions, which may sound odd. What we do is we hire scholars to look at an issue, scholars, others with expertise, and then publish it, right? So we actually don't have like a position on every possible issue you can think of. Instead, that's the approach we take because I think that's the high ground. And so, for example, sure, we could find someone, and maybe we still will, to go into the various studies on gender dysphoria and the arguments back and forth. But instead, I wanted to cut to the chase a little quicker and make a comparison precisely to raise questions in people's heads. And the quickest way to do that was to, okay, here's our policies across the 10 provinces in Canada. And what's Europe doing? What's the UK doing? Let's do some comparisons. And that naturally will bring up questions in people's heads. And as it turns out, as I was thinking about this and trying to find out who could do this, I talked to a friend of mine. It turned out to be one of the authors of the study and said, well, this other organization down in the United States, Do No Harm, has already done a study like this. And so what we did is I contacted them. Turned out I knew the executive director there. I'd met her some years before, chatted with her and said, can we update your study for you, add us, revise your US statistics for this year, and compare to Europe and publish it. And that's what happened. And it got a lot of attention. Like I said, Elon Musk found it and retweeted it and got 30 million views, one of the infographics from the study. So we did that very purposely because if you try and weigh in on every issue, first of all, it's difficult to find experts on an issue. You may think that's odd, but it's difficult to find experts who can analyze for a public policy forum and write. There's plenty of academics, for example, and with due respect, not all of them can write or communicate properly. And that's why sometimes they get the reputation they do. No, not picking on academics, here or retired. But that's just the difficulty. And also we wanted Canadians, right? We're very focused on Canada. So I was looking for some Canadian authors, which we found and paired with this US think tank that could do this. So a doctor that I knew out of Montreal and another doctor in Calgary here that turned out to have done some work on this and were familiar with the literature enough to make these comparisons. So frankly, what I wanted was a study that stayed on the high ground rather than went into all sorts of scientific debates, useful as they are, about gender dysphoria, because I didn't want to pretend I'm not an expert in it. And I didn't want someone who wasn't an expert in it either to get into the weeds. But again, point to the UK or to Sweden and say, really? You want to disagree with them? That's fine. Then you explain why they're wrong. So sometimes you have to take a bit of a shortcut approach, or also just this is the very narrow focus that we're using to see what's happening in this area. And then you can always expand on it later on with a more in-depth study. I mean, this was pretty in-depth in terms of the comparisons, but it didn't go into the literature of gender dysphoria. For that, I think you really want to have someone who is deep in the weeds as I don't know, a scientist or someone who's actually written on that. So again, finding that and getting them to publish and in a timely manner, getting them to communicate, agreeing to publish. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, and sometimes I just can't be bothered to jump through those hoops when you can make a comparison and start to raise questions about a potentially harmful policy that way. So you retreat to the high ground. And sometimes people don't like that because they want you to take a definitive position on something, which should be obvious. Look, I don't think, I'll go so far as to say, look, I think it's fairly obvious you shouldn't be feeding hormone blocking drugs or any body changing drugs to teenagers unless you absolutely have to. Do no harm, right? Our partners, the United States, that very concept communicates what should be the case, right? So, but again, I don't pretend to be an expert on gender dysphoria. If someone's 40 years old and really wants to change their sex, I'm kind of a libertarian on that. Go ahead. It doesn't tempt me, but if someone feels that way, I suppose they could. So I don't want to deny that there may be some reality there because I'm not an expert in it. I just think it's really, to me, counterproductive to change kids' bodies. And I just think it's dangerous and potentially stupid, worse than stupid. So, so again, that was my suspicion, and it seems the study we produced showed the caution of Europe, if I can put it that way. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think it does in many respects. So the next question is from Petrushka, and it may intersect with what you're going to in London. Her question is, what are your thoughts on the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, ARC, soon to be holding its second conference in London, UK?
Sure, that's actually the conference I'm going to. I was invited to go to it. I said, sure. If one of the sponsors of the conference paid the fee, because I wasn't going to take it out of our funds. London's expensive, as with the conference fee. So I'm going. So it could let you know when I get back. But a conference is like anything else. I mean, you get people with all sorts of different views there. Some you'll agree with, some you won't. Some of their views, you'll agree with some of their views of a particular person, and others not. So I don't know if I can really give an answer there. One of the reasons I set up the Aristotle Foundation was I wanted to make sure we looked at ideas on a consistent basis, ideas and policies out there. With the theory being, look, ideas lead culture, culture leads politics, right? And that's my theory of change, and it's our theory of change. Meaning, if you see something that's wrong out there, you can spend a lot of time lobbying politicians to do the right thing. I find that frustrating. I don't have the patience for it. And plus, I'd rather work in the idea sphere and the policy sphere to say, okay, let's try and go and talk to 80% of the if you convince 80% of the population
Yeah.
that what you're doing is in touch with reality and the existing idea is not, then you'll get the change, because politicians follow the voters. But you know something, if 90% of the voters think that 2 + 2 = 5, then that's what politicians will say eventually, even if they don't want to. But if they want to get reelected, they'll say 2 + 2 = 5.
Mm-hmm.
So our theory of change is that, like, work on the ideas, talk to the public directly. Increasingly, we're trying to, focus on how we can reach young adults, students and young adults. It's a big focus of ours. We're getting there. We've got some ideas on how to do that more, and we'll increasingly do that in the year ahead. And plus, we are actually an educational charity. That is our charitable purpose. So I think I've lost track of the original question, though. ARC. So I think conferences can be useful. I used to lead Civitas. I used to lead the Winston Churchill Society of Calgary to have speakers in. But a think tank, if it's any good, hopefully can be very public, do original stuff, get it out there. We literally think about how to market our work, publicize our work to make sure it doesn't sit on the shelf. And conferences like ARC may be useful. I'm sure it is. I've seen some good speeches from last year's, but it's hard for me to give an opinion, really, because I haven't been to one before. Again, you're going to find people you agree with and disagree with. I don't agree with some conservative commentators these days, like Tucker Carlson, who is, I think, completely wrong on Ukraine and what else. Winston Churchill these days, and some people love him. I think he's, to use a British term, I think it's a British term, off his rocker on Churchill. I don't think he's at the conference, but you're going to find people you disagree with all over the world and people you agree with. But I think it's probably a very good thing, because, perhaps they're putting people up on stage that, again, have been canceled elsewhere. Ayan Hirsi Ali, the Somali woman who became an atheist and then, who's Muslim, became an atheist, now is a Christian. She's an interesting person. I know of her work. I think she's got some deep concerns about the radicals in some segments of Islam. So she's going to speak there, at least virtually. So I think, yeah, you get interesting speakers. And when I was at Civitas, I tried to get interesting speakers that made people think. We're still trying to do that at Aristotle, but we're trying to do that through a very sort of public day-to-day way.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. So we have some specific questions from people who are interested in specific ideas. So I'll present them to you. One from Richard is, in the university system, we are building a DEI Canadian apartheid with federal research funding also now being dependent on DEI, which is also an issue I feel strongly about. Would the Aristotle Foundation be willing to investigate not just university DEI hiring policies, but also the intellectually destructive DEI university research funding?
Yes. In fact, we are doing that. We are doing that. We've got some work underway on that. I know some other think tanks have also done work on that. With any think tank, there's only so many things you can do in a year too. So we have to be choosy, right? But DEI has been a big priority for us. We probably published, I think, 6 studies in the past year and a half on DEI, starting with Matthew Lau in October 2023, basically making the Thomas Sowell argument, if you know that name, but in Canada, like, okay, here's the argument for what some people call reverse discrimination, or you can just call it discrimination. Here are the arguments for it. Here's why they're wrong. Here's the data on incomes in Canada. Here's why you really don't need to do DEI, right? Because other than personal prejudice, which can always crop up, and you can't eliminate that because you can't change the human heart, as I pointed out to people, Ontario began dismantling institutional discrimination in the 1950s, right? Before 1951 or 1952, if you're a Black, you could be told you can't be in this hotel. Or a woman, you might not get a certain job, or Jewish. That changed around 1951, 1952. And people yet think we still have institutional discrimination. We do actually now these days, and it's DI in reverse, right? Against, people with pale skin like me. But and again, I understand, and I don't think it's I think a lot of people that believe in DI think it's the right thing to do and to make up for the sins of the past. And as I write in the victim cult, though, yeah, but maybe you didn't suffer. Maybe your ancestors suffered. Maybe my ancestors suffered. But I don't want to make you suffer today for the sins of my ancestors. So this is nuts. It's not a very academic term, but that's how I think of it. But I do think some people are sincere about this. I just think they're sincerely wrong, and they don't grasp the damage they're doing, and that the core reason it was wrong, one of the reasons it was wrong to discriminate against people, 100 years ago, on the west coast of British Columbia in the fishery. If you were Japanese, you might not have a chance to fish in the commercial fishery because you were Japanese. That was discrimination. But the reason it was so egregious was because you were discriminating against people based on their skin color, ethnicity, and there was nothing they could do about it. And it had no relation to their job. There had no relation to what they were going to do. It's still wrong today, because but you can't make up for them. Again, unless you're really close to the era and there's some compensation for the wrongs committed by government or someone towards you. But 100 years later, you can't make up for that. All you end up doing is creating new injustices. I mean, I've heard of students who want to get into med school who have a 4-point grade average but can't get in because they're the wrong skin color. That's crazy. You want merit. And again, I don't care about skin color or ethnicity. I don't care if a faculty or a corporation or a business is, all one color or another. I don't care if it's all purple. I don't care if it's all women. I don't, care if it's all a recent immigrant cohort, if they're the most qualified for that job or that company or that university. Really, I don't care. I want people to be looked at as individuals. The other problem with modern identity politics, because that's what this is all about, is we often think because of the historic injustices based on skin color, that's the way to look at people. Well, as I pointed out in the victim cult, okay, what happens if you're, I don't know, a Chinese American woman who's a capitalist, born outside of the United States, not in China, maybe another country even. What's your primary identity, and you're a Christian. So is your primary identity Chinese, or is it a woman? Because maybe you value your feminism above all else. Is your ethnic identity Chinese? Is that your prime identity? Or is it the fact you're a capitalist business person in, California? Or, do you value being, I don't know, a wife above your capitalism? There's any number of ways you can identify yourself as a human being. And why do we always focus on these ridiculous things like unchangeable characteristics? Again, I understand why historically, because that's what people did when they discriminated against others. But to think today in a multicultural polyglot of a place like Canada, the United States, or other countries, that we should continue to discriminate based on these unchangeable characteristics, to me seems entirely unhelpful. And part of the research I found in the victim cult was that societies that do this, that say, I was here first, not you, your skin color is not like mine, race matters. That was the German thinking for the 18th and 19th centuries until it was beat out of them in 1945. These things are dangerous, pernicious, harmful ideas. And so even under done in the best of intentions, there was wrongs 100 years ago. We need to make up for that now. Or the belief that racism now, and there's some personal prejudice that can exist now, as I've said, the notion that racism explains all economic outcomes, or most of them, in terms of wealth or income, that's simplistic, and it doesn't. I could go on about why that is, but you can just even read the column today in the National Post. There's other things that matter to outcomes, including economic outcomes. And so we've got an entire generation of people, though, that think almost everything is due to race. No, it matters where you're born or where you live. If you're in a northern Manitoba reserve as an Indigenous person, that's your biggest strike against you. You're in the middle of nowhere, far from educational opportunities, far from career opportunities, far from a good income. So this is why the Industrial Revolution, people have been fleeing rural areas for the cities for 2.5 centuries, because that's where the money is. But we have people today that don't think even about simple things like that, like geography, or education, where, Taiwanese Canadians are the most educated among the population the last time I checked, or certainly for Americans. It's probably similar up here. That explains why East Asian Canadians and East Asian Americans earn more than anybody else on an apples to apples basis, because that's the most educated cohort. So things like that matter. But we have an entire generation raised on the notion that everything is due to racism, or most, and it's faulty. Long answer to short question. I do that a lot.
Thanks. That's okay. We just want to get to a few of the other questions, and I may cut them down a little bit in terms of verbiage so that you can
Okay.
answer them. And
I'll
then
try to do the same on my end. Yeah.
and then what we'll have to do is I would love to go to open mic so people can
Sure.
actually talk directly to you.
Yeah.
Okay, so just quickly here. From Robert, my question is, if ideas lead to culture and culture leads to change, then what ideas lead to Canada's nationhood? And more importantly, where did those ideas come from?
Sure. I don't claim to be an expert in Canadian history, but I'd say a couple of things, right? So Canada, of course, was, at least historically, in the historic understanding, a founding of two peoples, French and English. To be fair, we probably ignored the Indigenous stories as we did. But if you think of a French fur trader trading fur with an Indigenous person 500 years ago, and then you add the English on top of that, that kind of explains some of our history. But certainly, I would argue the ideas from classic British liberalism of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, Mary Wollstonecraft, and the rights of women, all that mattered to what people were thinking in the late 19th century as they created Canada and beyond. We're about to publish a book on John Diefenbaker, as I mentioned. I don't know if I brought up that.
Good.
And, he was a 19th century classical liberal, right? It's why he fought for civil rights in the 1930s and 40s as a lawyer. It's why he introduced the Bill of Rights in 1960. It's why he gave the vote. Parliament passed the vote to give Aboriginal Canadians the vote, which they should have never not had. But that was a result of the ideas in the 19th century. And they were the right ideas. Applied consistently? No, of course not. But they were seed ideas from John Stuart Mill and others that allowed the Anglosphere to gradually say, look, if you're Black, you are a person. If you're a woman, of course you're a person. Therefore, we should give you voting rights. But these things took a while to work out, because that was not how rights were seen initially. It was, you had property, then you could vote, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's where Canada, and also, this is topical these days. Canada, of course, was also created for two other reasons. One, in kind of a contradistinction to the United States, right? British North America. And also because the early founders, and I wrote about this in one of my first books, Tax Me, I'm Canadian, the early founders wanted a tariff-free zone from east to west, right? The provinces before Confederation were putting tariffs on each other. We still have that problem today.
Yes, thanks for that. So an interesting question here from Edward, right? And that's because I'm a big fan of Aristotle himself. Why is the Aristotle Foundation named after Aristotle? How would you say your foundation uses the approach of Aristotle? Would you say you go beyond that approach to try to accomplish certain goals? And does the AF actively seek out membership from universities, college societies, which might contribute to the discussion in a positive way?
On the last one, no. I mean, we have scholars that we kind of, pick up as we can. And so if people are interested in working for us as scholars, publishing a study, I mean, just, write to us and, we'll kind of go through the process. Aristotle, I do get this question usually from, philosophy professors and others, and I inevitably disappoint them because it's not as deep as you'd think. But I came up with the Aristotle Foundation because I thought, look, first of all, again, understanding, Western civilization, right? So you go back to ancient Greece and the debates, among the philosophers in Athens. Well, that was where the question of what does the good life look like, started, at least in the Western tradition. So, so I thought it was important to kind of start back there and send a signal, like, thinking about democracy, thinking about the good life. That was ancient Greece. That was ancient Athens. And I'm more of a fan of Aristotle than Plato because Aristotle was an empiricist, which is really the second reason why. I mean, I came up with the name and the board agreed to it. And some people said, that he was, a dead white male who had slaves. Yes, I know that, but it was 2.5 millennia ago. And that's part of the reason we're naming it, not the slavery, but that people would cancel him because of that is, again, part of the reason we're starting this. But no, really the empirical part, the empiricism of Aristotle as well, that, he has these debates I should know this, it's late at night here in Calgary, my brain's frozen by the -25, but Plato's Republic, and elsewhere where these debates go on, between what the good life looks like, and Plato is in favor of, sharing families and property and the rest of it. And, the counter is, people don't want to share these things, their family, their property in common. So there's an empirical approach. So with Aristotle, so that was Socrates, I guess. So, but Aristotle, the same thing, his writings on friendship, on politics, even, he had a very fulsome, if I can put it that way, portfolio that I thought needed to be appreciated. But the more simple reason is simply that, I think he was one of the obvious original empiricists in history. And so I wanted to send out that signal that, we weren't doing anti-empirical work. We weren't just wanting to publish opinions. We were going to try and ground them in data and statistics and history and reason, which doesn't mean our scholars are always going to get it right, but that's what we're aiming at.
Okay, great answer. Yeah, he was the original botanist and categorist. So there you go. What kind of response? This is from Mike, I think, the chairman. What kind of response did you have from your National Post interview regarding your report on DEI and university admission?
Good. I mean, it's been excellent, but we've had actually excellent responses to those papers since we started publishing them in 2023. And again, there's been about 6 of them. Matthew Lau's written 2. Bruce Party wrote one back in October. Queen's Law professor on the problems with Section 15.2 and Section 15.1, and especially how Section 15.1 of the Constitution is being interpreted.
Yeah.
So Bruce Party on that. We've had David Miller Haskell write about a literature review. The DEI doesn't do what you think it would do, at least according to its proponents. It does the opposite. It divides people. No, there's been very good response to actually almost all of these studies. Excuse me. Sometimes you publish things and they go nowhere, but I think there's great interest. I think precisely because people think there's something wrong with, a particular issue, but it's not been really researched or investigated or explained well. And then people go, oh, so one of the things, for example, in discrimination, I like to remind people of is a story by Thomas Sowell. Again, we're trying to do a lot of Thomas Sowell type work in Canada on these issues. Thomas Sowell, is brilliant because over his 50 years of publishing on this issue and others, is able to combine the data and empiricism with kind of good historical research. So he gives an example, which I think crystallizes the problem with blaming everything on racism. And it's not that it doesn't have an impact sometimes, but, he's a Black American who grew up in the South end of Harlem. He knows what racism is, but it doesn't impact people as much as you think in many, at least in liberal democracies. So Sowell gave the example of the fishing fleet worldwide, which historically has been dominated by Italians. And so he asked the natural question, and not the Swiss, is it because the fishing fleets are kind of predisposed and racist against the Swiss in favor of the Italians, or is there something else going on? The something else is geography. The Swiss have no coastlines, the Italians do. So don't go around blaming everything on one factor when it may be another. And so that crystallizes the problem of simplistic approaches to public policy or ideas. And anyway, I think by explaining in the studies we've done on DI, we've actually had, quite a tremendous response. If you look at the comments section, even the politicians have to respond. There was also an article in the Globe and Mail on the weekend, a very long essay defending DI. They didn't mention us, but I think the author probably read our work and was responding to it to some degree. But frankly, it wasn't a very good essay. I could pick it apart in a heartbeat, and we may publish a column, pointing out that some of her assumptions are flawed, right? Like, I think one of her comments, this professor that wrote in the Globe, it was something to the effect of, well, and people are also denying that racism exists. I don't know about others, but I'm not. I'm simply saying institutional prejudice of the type that banned Chinese Canadians from hospitals 100 years ago, or Jewish Canadians, doesn't exist because it's been outlawed since the 1950s, which doesn't mean you can't find a bigot. So she was throwing out a straw man a straw person, maybe in her case, that I thought was very weak. And the Globe published it. The Globe should know better. But, again, academics can be very convincing, even when I think their theories are full of holes in their claims.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that there's a propensity to define racism and discrimination in only one way. I say that from my own experience after living in Japan for
Mm.
7.5 years, and
Yeah.
no one speaks about the contemptible, subtle racism that takes
Mm.
place within that society. And it's because, of course, it's a time in which people are much more prone to beating up on white people, Christian people, and so on, and people from the West.
Yeah, I mean, look, I lived in Japan for 2 years, and there was some of that, and I saw it. On the other hand, to be fair to the Japanese, I mean, I think they're trying to address it, right?
Yeah,
So,
that's
but
right.
yeah, I mean, one of the ironies of the anti-Western rhetoric these days
Mhm.
is that, the Anglosphere anyway is one of the least racist places on the planet.
Yes,
Was reading
yeah.
something. There's a biography of, I don't know if it's obvious in the past shelf, on the shelf. Yeah, on Gandhi. You can see it just beside the victim cult back there. The author talked about Mahatma Gandhi, and it wasn't Gandhi, but it was someone else, like in 1905 in London. There's another person, but also East Indian, um, who, talked about how tolerant London was in 1905. I'm not
Yeah.
saying London wasn't perfect, or didn't have racist policies, but nonetheless, so um, I think again the focus and sometimes the history of this stuff, which is fine to acknowledge, keeps people away from, yeah, okay, what kind of country do you want now though? Do you really want to tell some kid who's 20 that he can't have a job because he's got the wrong skin color because some ancestor that looked like him also had a bad attitude?
Exactly.
So to me, it's about what kind of country do you want now? And I noticed this in Hong Kong, by the way. We'll go over time if that's okay with you. I'll just keep
Yeah, that's
answering.
okay. I just want to move on from this to
Sure. Let me give you this one example there from Hong Kong. I was there in 2013. You know what they told me? And this was vis-a-vis Beijing, who they're worried about then and more worried about now, of course, because of what's happened. They said there's three things we want: capitalism, the rule of law, and including the British legal system, and the anti-corruption efforts dating from the 1970s. And I thought, I never hear this in Canada. In other words, they admired the British inheritance. And you've seen flags sometimes flown in Hong Kong vis-a-vis Beijing, British flags, to say this is what we prefer, not you guys, because they know what they've been losing and lost.
yeah, that's
That
right.
was very telling to me. So to me, ideas matter more than your skin color. So can we get back to, what are good ideas and bad ideas and how to treat people as individuals? That's really, I really do want that Martin Luther King vision, which without simplifying his views here, because he had some that favored affirmative action. I don't. Nonetheless, that is a good vision to have.
Yeah, I write most of the posts for Freedom Defense Canada, and I wrote one called "Why I Miss MLK," right?
Right.
Just because of that balance, right?
Yeah.
So I think we'll go to open mic now. If people wanted to use ask Mark a
Please.
question directly, please go down or on top of your computer display and use the react button, which would give you like a hand raise. The reason we do that is because if not, people are waving their hands, we can't see them.
Mm.
So
Right.
anybody who wants a direct question?
Yeah, what motivates me, while you're thinking of questions, what motivates me on this is perhaps my own personal history. There's always a personal explanation, perhaps, but my grandparents, came from nothing on my dad's side, not much better on my mom's side, survived the Great Depression without going into great detail. And then, many of you remember the 1980s, and my parents lost everything there because of the 14%, interest rates or 20% interest rates. My dad was a small time builder. I'm just not a big fan. Like, life is tough enough that you don't need governments or corporations or anybody doing stupid things that also hamper your opportunities in life based upon, again, unchangeable characteristics that none of us can change, which I repeat myself. But so life can be tough enough: natural disasters, recessions, acts of God, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need people making life difficult for the individual who's just trying to do his or her best.
Yeah, thank you. And since I can't really see a person asking a question, I'll go through it right now. I'll ask one.
Sure.
So three questions I prepared. One was that, and I'll go to the second question in this case. There's a lot of talk these days about a vibe shift. I don't know if you heard this term.
No.
Okay, it's sort of like a result of the fact that people are abandoning liberal progressivism
Mm. Yeah.
government. They're also abandoning liberally progressive governments. And what they're doing is they are moving towards, especially in Europe, they're moving towards a right of center government or even right-wing governments, right?
Yeah.
And then, and I think part of this might be a part of the idea that, of course, Trump won the recent election, right?
Yeah.
So I'm personally feeling this gives people permission in one sense, even though they may not particularly like Donald Trump, and to say, okay, now I can express my point of view. I'm not under this cultural dictatorship or ideas. Do you think there's a vibe shift going on?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps. Well, there obviously is. And there's always going to be reaction to an existing government when times are bad, and then throw the bums out. So it's hard to discern how much of that is throw the bums out versus I really like the new guys or I like their policies. I try not to use right wing or left wing, and I'm going to write a column on this soon and perhaps produce a video. I mean, I'm a political scientist. I understand the historical origins of this, right? The right conservatives sat on the French Parliament, the right side supported the monarchy, the leftists didn't, and that's where we got the terms from. But they're increasingly not useful. A classic liberal 100 years ago would have been Wilfrid Laurier, and I would have supported Wilfrid Laurier over the conservatives, right? I mean, first of all, at the Aristotle Foundation, we're not going to favor a political party or a politician. It's not what we do, right? We'll do ideas and policy, but I don't endorse politicians. There's just no point for a whole bunch of reasons. And the labels are only, even the ideological labels, right? Small c conservative. I mean, most people are not deep into labels, so they don't necessarily understand what you say when you mean conservative, someone else means liberal, right? Again, a liberal 100 years ago is a conservative today. I mean, figure that out, right?
Yeah.
Donald Trump is a protectionist. That's not the conservatism I grew up in. If you look behind me, you'll see a picture of Reagan there. It's a campaign souvenir I found in Arizona from 1980, I think it is. The light's a bit on it, but Reagan was a free trader. There's great comments from him, some of them repeated in the past week, about don't pick on your allies. Free trade is good for all of us, right? Our allies are not our enemies.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing, but that was, one of his radio broadcasts. Well, that's not Donald Trump. Is that conservative? Not to me. So, but obviously, I think there's a lot of chaos out there. I think there's a great dissatisfaction. The post-war world, and then post 1989, where we thought we had a peace dividend, we sort of did.
Yeah.
Francis Fukuyama wrote about the end of history, not meaning that events would stop, but that there was no competitor to liberal democracy. Turns out there was. Tyrants kind of came roaring back in the last 10 years, especially. Some people like them. Some people like authoritarians. Islam has a certain radical element within it, and I'm not, again, or I'm not, to be clear here, I'm not saying all Muslims favor this. They don't. But if you look at the Iranian Revolution of 1979, there was a competition there, right? Theocratic Islam. That's a competitor for Western liberal democracy. And it has its own competitor. Young Iranians and expat Iranians don't like theocracies. You'll find a lot of the pushback on radical Islam will come from young Iranians and expat Iranians who really don't like what's happening.
That's right.
So there are competitors out there, but we're in a new world where, the dominance of a liberal democratic United States post-war world has ended. China's come back, and in part for good reasons. Remember, a lot of us fought in the 20th century, fought the idea battles because we wanted free markets and freedom to win, right? That was Reagan. That was Mulroney. That was Kohl. That was Thatcher. All right, we sort of convinced the Chinese to have to it. Right? They adopted some elements of markets. They just haven't, progressed to, a free and liberal democracy. So liberal and conservative doesn't mean much to me. But I think what's happening, obviously, is a reaction to some of the craziness of the past 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
And in some cases, the immigration policies of Europe, Canada, the United States have been too generous. I'm pro-immigration, but there's only so many people you can fit into a country at once and not have problems, right? Integration-wise, housing-wise. And I don't think it's crazy or radical or right-wing or reactionary to say that. It's just
that's right.
Make an observation. So I think what's happening is you're seeing people will vote for people who at least say it out loud. They may not be the most desirable characters, or they may. But I think I think you're onto something. I think there's certainly a reaction going on, and not a reaction in a necessarily a bad way. That's a descriptive term. When you tell people that they can't talk to their 15-year-old daughter because she doesn't want to tell them about what she's going through, and that they shouldn't be allowed to know what she's going through, I think parents are going to react, as one example, and they should react.
Okay, so we have another question from Petrushka, who has her hand up. So,
Petrushka,
can you turn up your volume, Petrushka? Sorry, I think you've muted yourself. Oops. Oh,
There I am. Okay. Thanks, Mark, so much. And I
Thank
like
you.
the Aristotle Foundation very much.
Thank you.
Recently have come in contact with it, and I'm delighted that you are going to London to the ARC event. I have watched that with great interest, and I'm so thankful for the reason that you and the ARC are bringing to our world. Reason, thought. Thank you.
You're welcome.
okay, great. I just have one more question. I think it might be a bit of a minefield in one way, but I'll ask it of you.
Sure.
And the question I'm thinking about when you brought up Laurier, I realized that Laurier is not going to be on the $5 bill anymore. I think Terry Fox is going to be on it.
Mm,
I don't have any problem with Terry Fox, of course. I grew up with that.
yeah.
The thing which I don't like is the wholesale way in which, over the last 10 years or so, there's been that people feel there's been a need to sweep through the culture, right? Removing Johnny McDonald, removing
Yeah.
Laurier. A mob tears down a statue, instantly they change the name of the Ryerson University.
Right.
So, what do you think is the single greatest ideological factor that legitimizes this and is behind this? Because it's
Mm,
like a Maoist cultural revolution is
yeah.
taking place on a milder level in Canada. I object to it deeply, not just because I'm
Yeah.
nostalgic, but also because it
Yeah.
doesn't represent. I mean, Viola Desmond was a
Mm,
fine person, right,
yeah.
and had a courageous act, but I don't consider her to be the equal in Canadian history of Johnny
Right.
MacDonald. And the demonization of MacDonald is, in my
Right.
opinion, somewhat satanic. So,
Right. Well, as you know, in the 1867 project, we had a couple of authors that dive into this. In the main, though, I think the reason this is happening, one, just kind of a simplistic view of history, right, including John and MacDonald. But maybe at the core of it is what I'd call a utopian view of history. If you think back to the 20th century, we've always had utopians in the world, religious utopians sometimes that, want to go off and create heaven on earth. Marxists were, of course, economic utopians, right? They thought they could create an economic paradise on earth. They were wrong, but you've got utopians in history. At least in the 20th century, you can argue that Marxists would argue they were being empirical. They were wrong. They did empiricism wrong, and their program didn't get us to freedom and flourishing, or flourishing anyway. They didn't care about freedom. But they would argue they were empiricists. I mean, they were having debates about numbers and what will lead to a better economy. But it was utopian to think you could get to some end where everybody could, hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, read at night, or vice versa, or whatever it was. And in the 21st century, you've got but at least they were looking towards the future. That's the excuse you can at least make for Marxists, right? The future hadn't happened yet. So maybe they were right. If you're in the vantage point of 1820 or 1917, maybe this is the right way forward because the future hasn't happened yet. But you got people today who are utopians about the past, which is by definition unchangeable. So to me, it just seems utterly bizarre. That you would expect people in 1867 to be perfect or to hold our views. And that's also immodest, right? I mean, Perry, you and I, 100 years from now, people will look at us and go, Perry, why did you believe that? Mark, why did you believe that? And you know something? They will be right. We'll be wrong in something obvious that escaped us today. And so I think a little modesty is in order here as well. And I think there's a bit of mob mentality going on. I mean, you mentioned the Cultural Revolution. It's true. Like people get on the self-righteous crusade, and that's another part of history. But I think at the heart of this is some weird utopian view of the past combined with the modesty.
I agree, and I think utopianism is extremely dangerous, right? And utopianistic states have always been or often been responsible for the mass slaughter of people in the pursuit of that, right?
Well, and purity. We produced a 5-minute video. If you look at our website at AristotleFoundation.org, look at our video in 1984. We did a 5-minute video. And it's a purity element as well. What did Mao want? A pure culture, cleansed of the past. What did Nazi Germany want? Adolf Hitler wanted a pure race, cleansed of what he thought were impure people. So anyone who wasn't a white, German, and a white Aryan. So this purity notion can also be very dangerous, which is actually a utopian notion all on its own, but in addition to simply being wrong about science.
Yeah, on my little schedule here, we've got 8:20 until we want to spotlight Mike. So I've got another question from Edward. So Edward,
Please.
you don't have to
Edward, please.
mute yourself. There we go.
Yeah. Just a second here. I'm going to see whether I can pull up my statement. I agree with you wholeheartedly on so much of what you've said tonight. I think very much of our House of Parliament with 338 MPs divided into parties and voting by party and being very partisan in everything that they do. At least it's very rare that you find them breaking rank and actually thinking about whether maybe somebody in another party might have something worthwhile to contribute. And my question to you would be, do you see that the Aristotle Foundation might have something to say to that situation, might have something to contribute to a House of Parliament that's more likely to listen?
To each other? Well, I mean, I have in the past, and we will actually put out some work on this in the future year here, but it's not necessarily what you've mentioned there, Edward, in this sense. I think it may be impossible to get away from partisan politics because the pull is too strong in that you want to win with your party against the other guys. And then once you're in, if you want to get into cabinet, you don't want to displease the leader. And so that's pretty strong. In the US system, it was set up differently, but even there, you see a strong pull not to disagree with the president these days, right? Which I don't think is actually healthy in the American case. You see the Senate not, I think, sometimes do its duty vis-a-vis some of the choices that Donald Trump has put forward, I would argue. But at least in the US system, like institutionally, the House leader, the leader of the House of Representatives, the Senate House leader, majority leader, they got their literal own power base, courtesy of the Constitution, as does the White House. But it was set up that way because the American founders understood that concentrated power is dangerous. They didn't want another King George III. So they didn't want a dictator or a monarch. So in the Canadian system, of course, the British parliamentary system, even though in theory all the MPs are independent, what's happened is partisan politics. So how do you change that? Well, I think you have to create another power base, so to speak, which is why I hinted at it earlier, I think. I'm a big fan of referendums and also recall. And the reason I am is because what that does is it allows citizens to have input into the system more than once every 4 years. And often, and I'm not being cynical, like every 4 years, it's a beauty contest, or it might be one issue, if that. And so I think it's better to tweak the system on an ongoing basis. And the Swiss do this pretty regularly. And US states have referendums, in some cases recall as well. One is proactive, one is reactive. But that then would allow, because behind the scenes, politicians will complain about citizens that they're not informed. And sometimes they're right. And citizens will, of course, complain that politicians are X, Y, or Z, and they're right. But so the way to bridge that gap or cut through that Gordian knot is to say, fine, have an open kind of discussion or debate, so to speak. Let me give you a clear example of what I mean. In 1992, I remember the Charlottetown Accord referendum, right? Now, I was a political science student. This interested me. It actually interested also a lot of my friends who had no interest in politics. Why? Because they had a chance to vote. And so we were debating, and I would, debate them. Should Quebec have special status? Should Indigenous peoples have certain representations guaranteed as a parliamentary seat? So on and so forth. These ideas were debated by ordinary people who wouldn't normally debate them. So to me, that showed the power of referendums. I'm not saying every day, every issue, and there's ways to design them properly or, to that sort of thing. But to me, that's the way you could impact the power of parliament and the power of majority governments that just kind of do whatever they want, for good or bad. And also it would help politicians. If politicians really don't want to deal with a contentious issue because they just know they're going to get burned on both limbs and both feet, fine. Toss it to a referendum, right? The Swiss have voted on capital punishment, on joining the EU, on immigration, on everything, minimum wage. And, Swiss is not considered a crazy place. Switzerland isn't considered a crazy place. So I think actually introducing referendums, even though some people say it's a graft on the parliamentary system, yeah, it would be, but I think it'd be a decent parliamentary reform or democratic reform. So I'm in favor of it. And there's some legislation, as you know, in British Columbia and Alberta. It's not very workable, but I mean, on the island there back in 2001, I think it was, or 1997, there was a fellow who almost got recalled because he lied about himself in papers, wrote to papers pretending to be his, praising himself under a pseudonym. That was found out. I think there was like 20,000 signatures of people that signed up that were about to recall him, and he quit. I want to say Wrightsman. I think it was Paul Wrightsman on the island there. And so that was a good example of the power of recall. And it kept, it was an accountability tool. So that's how I would change the system. But I've been arguing this for 20 years and getting nowhere. But, I think it would help.
Thanks very much. One more question is here from Ken and/or Irene Oakes. So you guys can go ahead. Is the sound on? You might be
It's muted.
It's muted, guys.
Got it, Irene?
Yep, you're good. Go ahead.
I'm looking at what has happened in the last 30 years. Okay, the fabulous time for me was the 70s.
Okay.
But also, as I look at things, I find out that something is healthy often because what's driving it is the positive mode to build. And it's been troubling me so much that, like, for example, my ancestors came early in the 1880s here, and they came as settlers, and they built. Okay. I'm thinking also of the historical background to Scotland. Okay, when Locke, the philosopher,
Right.
that the primary right was to have property.
Right.
And yet I'm here, there's rising. It's like, there's been a non-building, tearing everything down. Even so, I hope, and this is my fear. Well, can we say my hope is that there is a turning to view building and being constructive, okay, as part of the gift of being in Canada.
Yeah.
Do you see a turning?
Well, I hope so. And again, I think all you can do is honestly describe the problem as best you see it and hope that you're describing it right. Let me read our vision statement of the Aristotle Foundation, because this was precisely why we did the 1867 project and also why we set up the foundation. And we thought a lot about this, right? So our vision statement is this: a Canada where the sacrifices and successes of past generations are cherished and built upon, where citizens value each other for their character and merit, and where open inquiry and free expression are prized as the best possible path to a free, flourishing future for all. Let me read it one more time. A Canada where the sacrifices and successes of past generations are cherished and built upon, so touches on what you mentioned there, where citizens value each other for their character and merit. In other words, we treat each other equally as individuals today in the law and policy. And where open inquiry and free expression are prized as the best path to a future, a free, flourishing future for all. That's our vision. And that speaks to exactly what you said, precisely because I was concerned about people ripping stuff down and thinking that they could just Phoenix-like, create a better entity from the ashes. That's a revolutionary, utopian, usually mistaken impulse, right? And so again, the oak tree analogy is, the oak tree is not perfect, but it's pretty good. Shelters a lot of people. Again, if you and I were living in the Soviet Union or Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, I would say tear the place down, right? But we're not. And Johnny MacDonald was not, despite the crazies out there who think otherwise. He was not some sort of genocidal maniac, as Greg Piasecki writes in her book, The 1867 Project. For all his faults, and he had some, we all do, he was trying to sign treaties in the British tradition with, the natives of the day, and signed some, didn't sign in some other places, we know, for various reasons, but tried to do right 9 times out of 10, I would argue, and Greg would argue, in the 1867 project. And, and some of the opposition did not want to go down the road that Johnny MacDonald did. But think about this. I mean, the British, who really value the rule of law, tried to sign treaties and now are pilloried for what? Not signing enough, and just the other attacks on the British colonial record, as opposed to what the American record, the Indian Wars, as they're called, or, the Spanish and Portuguese empires, which really were pretty rapacious empires. They didn't bring the rule of law because they weren't free marketers. They weren't John Stuart Mill types, before the time of John Stuart Mill. I mean, the British and Portuguese empires were pretty brutal. So was the Russian Empire, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you don't want to excuse the occasional bad things that happened in colonial history, but I don't think you have to. You just look, don't expect perfection from human beings, but an empire that actually introduced the rule of law. I mean, starting back with, what is it, the proclamation of, what's the right date here? Somebody can remind me, 1700s there.
1963.
Thank you. Yeah. And then the other work they've done, and the fact that the British Empire fought slavery. One of the things I remind people in Canada of when I get the chance in our writings and elsewhere, it's also in the 1867 project, I think, in one of the chapters, is let's not romanticize our ancestors, anybody else's ancestors, right? So it's the British that were busy wiping out slavery in the 19th century. And they came to British Columbia, and there were some, with respect, First Nations in Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska that held slaves until the late 19th century, in some cases. And Governor Douglas sometimes bought slaves because that was the only way to free them from some First Nations. I don't want to pick on First Nations because, again, slavery was pretty ubiquitous in the 19th century. But the point is, the British, for all the criticism they get today from revisionists, were the ones attacking, slavery. And most of you live in the island, I understand. The other work we've done is around Victoria. If you look at some of the early records of Victoria, this is written about, I've written about this and others have, around 1858, you had like 30 Black Americans come to Victoria and loved it. Why? Because they had freedom compared to California. They were allowed to be citizens after 2 years. They were welcomed by Governor James Douglas, who I think was mixed race as well.
Yeah.
And the Anglican Archbishop of the day in Victoria welcomed them with open arms. This was not the treatment they were getting in California or certainly the American South. It doesn't mean that there was no racism. I assume there might have been. But to be able to become a citizen, run for council, go to the local Anglican church in 1858, 1860, this is also part of Canadian history, which we should be proud of. And it's far above what was happening in the rest of the world. Saudi Arabians didn't, abolish slavery until a century later. I'll pick Victoria in 1860.
Great. Okay, where are we now? Okay, I think we're going to close the questions and the questioning. So thanks very much, Mark, for your brilliant answers to all of this.
Thank you. It was fun.
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. So we're going to spotlight Mike and remove me. Okay. And we'll go through-
Okay. Thank you, Perry, for fielding the questions, and Mark, for I guess you were the one fielding. But thank you so much for this really wide-ranging discourse. It was good to have people involved. Thank you all for participating this evening, all the folks who joined us tonight, for your questions, for your comments, and we just really appreciate the opportunity to get together and have this conversation with Mark. I want to just spotlight one thing here for the attendees. Just want to encourage you to do two things. One of them is to just subscribe to our Substack, FDC Substack, and also we welcome you to comment on our posts on Facebook and also on our other social media platforms. That'll help us out, encourage other people to take a look. We also want to give a big thank you to Mark Milke for joining us tonight and for all your insights, Mark, and for sharing with us tonight. We thank you so much. We look forward to a future relationship along with you and the Aristotle Foundation.
Yeah.
We also wish you the best as you go to London. May it go well with you, and we look forward to further reports from the foundation and from yourself as well. So thank you very much, Mark. So with that said, we want to thank each one of you for coming tonight. Wish you all the best this evening, and again, look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you all. Good night.